Good afternoon, everybody, particularly to the punctual people that are here the very minute this webinar begins. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are here to unpack what was a very thrilling election on Saturday night. So we'll be getting into the messaging that worked, we'll be talking about the results, and we'll also be talking about how the media covered the campaign. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce you to our panel of experts. If you are joining today, we will have time for your questions at the end of this session today. We have, however, muted your microphones, so you'll have to send your question to us in the written format. So if you look for the question mark icon on the right-hand side of your screen for questions, or the speech bubble to put anything in the chat area, and we will get to those questions at the end as well. So feel free to put them in at any point throughout the session. All right, so for questions, you're looking for the question mark or the speech bubble icon to join the conversation with us today. And I think now it is time to introduce you to our panel of experts. We're talking about a thrilling election, but I'm pretty thrilled about the panelists that we have with us today. So joining me to talk about how Australia voted, we have Bernard Keane, the Senior Political Editor at Crikey, and before that position, Bernard was Crikey's Canberra Press Gallery correspondent, so covering politics, the economy, national security. And Bernard, you're also the author of several books dealing with politics, things like Surveillance, War on the Internet, and A Short History of Stupid. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, great to be here.
We also with us have Christine Hurd, and Christine has more than 25 years experience in journalism and communications. And Christine, you've reported for places like the ABC, SBS and Channel 10, but after leaving journalism, you became accredited as a Media Skills Network media trainer, and you've started your own consultancy, Hurd Communication. Thank you so much for joining us, Christine. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about what you thought about all of those politicians on the campaign trail.
Thank you, Ali. I'm interested to hear what everybody else has to say as well, so thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. And rounding out the panel, we have Andrew Ledovskihk, who is an insight specialist at Isentia. So as a very experienced media analyst, Andrew does things like work with our clients to talk about risk and opportunity in the media cycle. Andrew also has a real passion for the media, and if he's looking tired, it's because he is coming fresh off analysing the election campaign as part of our partnership with Crikey. So he has been very deep in the numbers, the messaging, and what the media is saying. So thank you for joining us today, Andrew. All right. I think I'm just going to get started. We've got an excellent panel and a truly mind-boggling election to talk about. What surprised everybody? Christine, I might start with you. What surprised you about Saturday?
Okay, the result surprised me, Ali. I honestly wasn't expecting it. I'm no Bernard. Day-to-day politics is not my jam. Yes, I was a political correspondent in another lifetime, but I don't immerse myself in politics all the time. Yeah, I knew there were Teal independents, and I knew they were saying some really interesting things. I knew there was an awful lot of money being spent by the United Australia Party. I knew that Morrison was on the nose, but I honestly had no idea that we would get the result that we did. My personal feeling was that Australians wouldn't want to elect a new government and risk that instability, given that we're still coming out of a global pandemic. But what the hell do I know? I was completely wrong.
What about you, Bernard? What surprised you?
Probably two things. One was the sheer strength of the Teal vote. I mean, Kylie Tink's my is now my local member because I live in Chatswood in Sydney, and I thought she was the least likely to get up. And at about 7:30 on Saturday night, I was looking at the first numbers from North Sydney, and I thought, wow, she's doing really well. And I just got straight in my car and went over to her election night party, and I spent the rest of the night there because I thought the story of this election is the sheer strength of the Teal vote, and the fact that Trent Zimmerman ended up conceding pretty early on was really a demonstration of how incredibly strong that vote was. The other thing, I guess, was WA and Victoria, how hard they swung to Labor. That was, for the two states that have been singled out as the lockdown states, if you like. The two states most relentlessly criticised by the media for their approach to the pandemic were the two states where the coalition really just got absolutely hammered. And that goes against everything I think that we've been hearing from the mostly Sydney-based media now for the last 2 years.
I'll go to you quickly, Andrew, and then I think we should talk a little bit more about the media coverage of the election. But Andrew, you've been right in the thick of that media data. Were you surprised? Were you still managed to feel surprised at some point on Saturday night when things started to turn?
I think that, I mean, when you go seat by seat, and I agree with Bernard, the independents obviously was a big surprise in terms of how many seats they won. But I think, going to Christine's point as well, I think one thing that's really surprising is just how bad Australian media is and how bad Australian pollsters are about communicating about polls. You're going into an election with a 6-point lead, and yes, there were some issues in 2019. But I think, it was clear that the polls were well overrated in terms of by the media and by the individuals about what they actually said about the chances of ALP or the Liberals winning in the last election. I mean, even if the polls were accurate, the chances of them leading in the two-party preferred vote was still like 30% for the LNP. And this time, I think with the hangover, it went completely the opposite direction. And people are looking at 6-point polls, even though pollsters are making corrections and thinking, oh, this is going to be a tight race. And I don't know, I guess maybe not having gone through that emotional cycle, I'm looking at these polls and thinking, going into election night, I'm like, I don't know how the seat by seat breakdown is going to look, but I would be very surprised. When I was telling a friend, I'd be very surprised if the LNP gets within 3 points of the ALP in terms of the two-party preferred vote, because that would just be very unlikely with the polling results we saw. But I think the other one, the big one is that, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but is Queensland now the heartland of the Greens? Those victories in Queensland, I mean, I know it's Brisbane, and I think that highlights the regional metro split and how wide it's getting, but it's just kind of crazy too. When I'm looking up, I'm like, am I looking at the right state here? Am I looking at the right seats? That was kind of interesting for me.
I know, I saw a really funny meme on yesterday, I think, saying, people in Brisbane look down at the rednecks in Sydney and Victoria for electing so few Greens members. Both of you have touched on the media, though, and the media coverage and the discrepancy that we saw. And I've seen a lot of commentary on that, commentary about choices that the media made in covering this election, even though I know that's not one lump. Bernard, would you be able to expand a little bit on that? You've talked about the Sydney-based media, but where was that reality gap between the coverage and the results the most prevalent for you?
Oh, it was all over the place. I mean, the media's performance during this campaign has been the worst I've ever seen. And I've been watching elections since I was a kid. Sad admission to have to make back in the 80s. And it was the worst in this campaign. So just to pick one particular area of weakness, the absence of climate as a dominating issue was really quite remarkable. Now everything's clear in hindsight, of course, but it's pretty clear that a substantial proportion of the electorate was moved in their decision about how they're going to vote by the issue of climate change. Other issues were important too, of course. And look at the 3 issues that were named by the Teal independents were climate, integrity, and inequality, particularly gender inequality. Other terms like respect were also used as well. All were really important, but climate was clearly a driving force in this election, and its absence from the coverage, and both in terms of its absence from the campaigns from both sides, but also from the media as being the sort of issue that they were pressing the leaders to talk about, was really quite remarkable. And the fact that climate kind of hovered, it slowly grew over the course of the campaign in the data that Isentia gave us, but it never quite broke through as a key issue. And I find that quite stunning, given what we now know about what was animating so many voters, particularly in urban electorates, but also in a lot of rural electorates as well. I mean, there was some very strong independent performances in National Party held seats, and they didn't quite break through. But you can see the next election, you know, if things continue as they are, they may well do so again. So that was probably for me the starkest.
What do you think that means for the media now? Like, how are journalists, how are reporters going to have to start thinking about the way that they talk about climate? I know I wanted to ask you that later, but it just flows on quite nicely to this point right now.
I think it reflects the way in which a lot of our political journalism is now done. A lot of our political journalism is now done driven by producers and editors. The people who are on the campaign trails with the leaders tend to be more junior journalists. They tend to, the questions that they ask the leaders during the course of the campaigns are dictated by their producers and editors. And they tend to reflect the kind of in-house agenda of the particular media companies that they work for, most obviously the case of News Corp, but also to an extent elsewhere as well. And that means that the day-to-day coverage of the actual leaders' campaigns tends to be very much shaped by traditional mainstream media news values. They like images, they like simple messages, they like conflict. They're not really interested in policy, and you know that's amplified over the course of the campaign. It's also a classic case of just being out of touch. I mean, everyone remembers back in 2016 in the United States after Trump won, there was this sort of reaction from the media like, oh, we completely missed the rise of Trump supporters. We need to investigate this. And they sent journalists out, oftentimes almost naively, sent journalists out to red states and to community that has supported Trump.
In Michigan, yeah, but anyway, go on, sorry.
And try and understand what was going on. I think in some ways we need a similar process this time, except it's kind of the reverse. We need the media to kind of break out of their bubble and go and talk to people in affluent seats where there's a high level of education, not kind of the outer suburban ring, which is where most media companies target their products, because those media companies are, apart from the ABC, are driven by commercial interests, and they make the bulk of their money from certain demographics, and those demographics don't tend to be the ones that crop up in inner city or very affluent communities. They're more interested in middle income, suburban and outer suburban seats, and I think that's played a role in dictating the lack of relative interest in climate change.
Speaking of affluent seats, Christine, I might ask you for your thoughts about what happened in Warringah. What did we see there around the difference between coverage and the results that we saw?
Yeah, really interesting, because the data that Isentia was sending through showed very clearly that Catherine Deves was a really prominent voice in this campaign. If she wasn't talking, and she didn't do an awful lot of talking to the media, but if she wasn't talking, people were talking about her. So she was a very, very prominent figure in the campaign, but that did not translate into votes, which just goes to show that the whole idea of any publicity is good publicity is not true in an election campaign. If all of the publicity about you is negative or controversial, as it was around Catherine Deves, that does not mean that people will know about you, therefore they will vote for you. You need to be able to combat that negative narrative about yourself by coming out and talking about other issues. Show yourself to be more than one-dimensional. Actually engage in debates, have something to say on different topics. But Catherine Deves didn't do that. So despite the huge amounts of publicity she got, Warringah was one of the very first seats to be called on the night. So she got nowhere near to upsetting Zali Steggall. So no publicity, any publicity is good publicity, is just not true.
And potentially any advertising spend is not good advertising spend if we're looking at the United Australia Party as well. I would not be happy if I'd signed off on that.
Oh no, so they haven't even got one seat in the lower house, I don't think, Bernard. They might get a Senate seat, I think, but for that huge amount of spend, they were very visible and they were talked a lot in the media as well. It just didn't translate.
I think that's a good point, but it highlights the difference between the independents and the major parties. So like you're at a different place. If you're an independent, and there was a lot of attacks on those teal independents, and I think Bernard wrote about it a fair bit, it gives airtime to people who can't rely on a really strong brand recognition from LNP or ALP. If you go in, for the independents, it probably did serve a positive function, even as they were getting attacked and criticized, because it meant that people were really aware of who these candidates were, and that name recognition is super important early on. If you're coming out of nowhere, if you're on the ballot for LNP or Labour, like you almost might want to just avoid media coverage. You might just rely on people voting for the National Party if you don't have a strong challenger. But yeah, it's a good point. There is a distinction, and I think if you're an LNP candidate and getting that much coverage, something might be going wrong, probably going wrong. But if you're an independent and you're getting that coverage, even if it's criticism, there's still some nuance there where I think that was actually maybe a positive for a lot of these independent candidates, how much they were talked about, even negatively.
We've talked
just on the, Ali, if I may, just on the grapevine. I went to the hairdressers, which is in Warringah. And there were lots of women getting their hair done who were talking about Catherine Deves. And I heard one of them say that, she knew Catherine Deves, and that Catherine Deves was, really happy with the amount of coverage that she was getting, given that she was such a new face. And I was just sort of thinking to myself, ooh, yes, but is it the right kind of coverage? And I just don't think it was.
I love that your reporter's instincts are still so strong. You're at the hairdresser. What am I going to say? How am I going to turn this into election content? I wanted to ask you, though, Christine, we've talked about a reality gap between the election coverage and the election results, but there's also been a massive gap that we've seen from those results with how the Liberal Party has sensed the mood of how people were feeling about them. We've got a lot of people on this call today who might be working as a professional communicator. What lessons can somebody learn there? If someone was your client, how much time do you spend on sensing the mood or research? What's important there?
It's hugely important, and I'm going to give you 2 words: situational awareness. If you are not situationally aware, which means you're able to note what else is going on around you and how that may then have to play into how you modify or adapt what you're saying, if you don't have that level of greater awareness, you are going to fail to read the room. And I think we saw that beautifully in the 3rd debate between the leaders, when after a whole hour of them going hammer and tongs at each other, they were asked to say something nice about each other. And Albanese managed to do it. He said, I really respect Scott Morrison's stand on mental health and how much he's done for improving that. And then he stopped. But Scott Morrison said, well, look, I think Albanese's done well to come from, very humble beginnings to lead a party. But I don't think that means he's got the smarts to run a country. If you can't even think about what the unemployment rate is or the cash rate is, what hope have you got? And he went straight back into politicking. And I think they forgot who their audience was. Their audience was undecided voters who wanted to be able to see that this person that they were thinking about voting for was a human and could actually be nice to another person and not always behave as a politician. And I think Scott Morrison totally failed to read the room. He had no situational awareness. He was very, very blinkered, which I think is very similar to what happened with the women vote. Clearly, if they'd read the room about female voters a lot earlier on, they might have been able to stop the move away.
I mean, absolutely. I think that's a really fascinating recollection. Bernard, I might go to you now. For what relationship did you see between Saturday's polling, the polling that we saw, and the prominent topics of discussion, particularly in media coverage throughout the election? How did the issues that were always top of the homepage actually reflect in what polled? What had cut through for you?
Well, the campaign was, I guess, the coverage of the campaign was dominated by cost of living issues. That's, the statement of the blindingly obvious, and rightly so. There was a huge inflation rate spike during the middle of the campaign. Australia has not had significant inflation now well, really for a very long time, but certainly not since the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, when we had a mining investment boom. And to see that level of inflation followed, of course, by the interest rate, right? So cost of living issues were rightly pretty significant. All the more significant for the media because, as I said, their bread and butter audience tends to be very focused on cost of living issues. So clearly, that's going to be something that, both from a perspective of reality and perspective of commercial need, that's going to be top of mind. And of course, that also played to Labor's strengths. Now, the key strategy for progressive parties in any election is to steer the economic debate away from the broad level macroeconomic management and get it down to managing the economy for households and for workers. If you can do that, then you can own the economic management debate in a way that traditionally belongs to conservative parties. People instinctively think that the right are better economic managers. However, however little that may actually, link up with reality. So if Progressive Party can steer that debate onto bread and butter issues, onto your household income, onto your bills, then they're doing a lot better. So Labor was very, very happy to sort of watch that direction in the sort of cost of living issue, and B, help it along. So it was kind of a happy coincidence from the Labor point of view. From Scott Morrison's point of view, of course, that was just the last place he wanted it to go. He wanted to talk about jobs. He wanted to talk about a strong, growing economy. He didn't want to be talking about cost of living issues. So, clearly that was a pretty unwelcome development for him. The other thing, of course, was the focus on gaffes and the fact that, again, the media loves not just gaffes, but things like late in the campaign, this claim that Albanese was running away from questioning, the idea of yelling questions at him and interrupting his press conferences. Again, this reflects, just putting aside the ideological agenda of some of the people that were doing that. Again, the media loves conflict. The media loves a simplistic narrative. The media loves an easy story, not a complex story. Why would you want to be talking about childcare and the budget implications of Labor's commitments to childcare when you can be trying to catch him out on his own policy, that sort of thing. There's a very fine line between good, healthy scrutiny of a politician and gotcha questions, and I think that line was sailed over pretty clearly early on. So I've long been a critic of the fact that political journalists are driven by the need for very simple stories, or the desire for very simple stories. And a lot of that's not their own fault. Again, it's their editors and producers who, if you're putting together a 6 p.m. news bulletin, you want the most entertaining thing. You want the thing that's going to keep people watching. So a car crash on Parramatta Road is going to be much more interesting than some politician talking about, energy policy. So you're going to want that kind of much more interesting story. That's driven the media, and as our media has shrunk, and as our media has concentrated, and as we've got fewer and fewer journalists, younger journalists who don't have as much experience, that tendency to go for simple narratives has, become much more amplified, and obviously to the detriment of the quality of political coverage. And we've ended up with, as I said, the worst election coverage that I've seen.
Andrew, what would you add to that? How did you see some of that messaging evolve or simplify throughout the campaign?
Yeah, I think what Bernard's saying is super interesting, and I think that simplification generally benefits conservative parties, because they are often talking about things that are maybe a little bit simpler to understand, simpler to deal with. Jobs and growth, things that are easy to digest, and partially because they're not often running on change, so they're not talking about necessarily big, bold, new ideas that need to be unpacked and understood. You're not talking about climate change. You're not talking about equity and, the trade-offs and expenditures on social housing and the flow-on benefits that education has to the wider economy and community. Albo talking about productivity, Albanese talking about productivity was a big one. Like that was that's the sort of argument that Labor has to get into when they want to justify spending. They have to talk about how it doesn't affect inflation because of increased productivity. It's not something that's simple. It's not like growth or less spending or lower debt. These things are actually quite simple and make sense to people. It doesn't mean they're better, they just do. And the media being simpler generally helps conservative parties, I think. And I think the Liberals went in with a really simple messaging. So the top 5 leading messages, in fact, I think 31% of all talking points that we picked up early on in the campaign from Scott Morrison was just him talking about the economy just generally. No real specific like breakdowns, but it was mainly just the economy just generally. And I think 50% of all his talking points were made up from like 3 issues. It was unemployment, infrastructure, and the economy generally. Just strong economy sort of talk, like economic recovery sort of talk. And I think they wanted to keep it there. It was just, this was probably the worst cycle for that space, because that works best when things are going well. And things just aren't going well. You can't run it on trust when you're like double digits down on approval rating and you have real problems with how people see you. You can't run on economy when inflation spikes and interest rates are going up and there's great economic uncertainty, and the aftermath of COVID is still causing problems for individuals and businesses, and there's underemployment. You can't run on that. And I think they tried to kind of thread some sort of weird needle of saying, well, imagine how much worse it would have been if we weren't here. And that suddenly gets into a complex space. That's not where conservative parties, I feel, are generally most comfortable. So definitely over time, as that messaging evolved, Scott Morrison was kind of forced to be pushed to talk into a whole bunch of issues that he didn't want to. Generally, when we saw a transformation of messaging over time, Labor was kind of more picking the topics they wanted to expand into as things developed, increasing their talk about cost of living, talking more about skills investment, and even choosing to talk about productivity as a response to how do we manage improved spending. Whereas the things that LNP added to their messaging, to their leading messages, were really things that Labor would prefer to talk about, as Bernard said, taking it down to the household level, talking about housing and mortgages and skills investment, joining Labor on skills investment, and wages, getting into a wages debate. They really were trying to keep it simple. It really wasn't working for them, and they were forced to kind of, without the initiative, without the momentum, they were forced to kind of start fighting on Labor's turf. And that really played out with the leading issues across the media. When we look across the entirety of the campaign, which we've just done, and we'll provide some data around that for Christine and Bernard after this, there's barely a single issue in the leading issues that really is favorable for LNP, that the LNP really wanted to talk about. There's some neutral issues there where maybe they're on even ground and they can fight on, but pretty much all the issues are issues that Labor wants to talk about. Climate change and cost, they want to talk about wages, they want to talk about climate change, they want to talk about housing and healthcare and childcare and aged care. And the LNP went in absolutely trying to avoid all of that conversation based on their early messaging, it appeared.
We've been talking about those leading messages, but I want to talk about the leading politicians quickly before we get to the teals, because I know we've got a lot of conversation that we want to get to around the teals as well. Christine, I've got a very vague question on my run sheet, which is just, where did Scott Morrison go wrong, and how did that so badly affect the Liberal Party? If he was coming into you as a client in your consultancy, what are the lessons there for Scott Morrison and the Liberal Party?
Well, I think to begin with, there would be the situational awareness piece, which I've already talked about, and he clearly didn't have enough of that 6 months, a year prior to the election starting, let alone during the actual election campaign. But I would like to touch on his comment. Look, I know some people can think I'm a bit of a bulldozer at times, and I have been. Oh my God, that is the worst possible thing he could have said. Because even though he's trying to say, I'm not going to be that anymore, the most important or most interesting word in that sentence was bulldozer. And so everybody grabbed onto that. And then when he ran over the kid, I mean, it was just, you can't write this stuff, right? And then it allowed Anthony Albanese to say, well, bulldozers wreck things. I'm a builder. I like to build things. So I would say to Scott Morrison, think about the language. Think about the imagery that you are drawing upon, because even though you're trying to say, I'm not that, if that's really interesting imagery, people will grab onto that as well. And so I think he really played that very badly.
Speaking about grabbing onto things, like, what do you think it is that made the Teal independence so successful? What was there for people to really grab onto?
Yeah, a lot, I think. First of all, they looked different. They were female, urban, professional women, which is totally different to the male, pale and stale thing that we're used to seeing in federal parliament. I think they had an army of followers which they took along with them, which became part of the picture story that TV journos could tell. Really excited, enthusiastic volunteers, and you kind of got a sense of FOMO from watching them, going, wow, I'm actually really missing out. This looks like a party, man. Like, should I be here? I thought they did that really, really well. I thought they told stories really well. I heard Monique Ryan in her debate with Josh Frydenberg tell the story of being a neurologist in a Melbourne hospital during the pandemic and how incredibly tough that was and how that has in part prompted her to stand for Parliament. And then I heard Zoe Daniel talk about the story behind Vida Goldstein, who is what Goldstein, the electorate, is named after, telling her story and then very quickly and cleverly tailoring that back into Zoe's own story. So I think they told stories really well. They also used evidence really, really well. When they said, look, having independence in Parliament is a good thing, they were able to point to Zali Steggall and the Climate Bill, Helen Haynes and the Federal ICAC Bill, Rebecca Sharkey and the changes to the Religious Discrimination Bill. And so they had the evidence to back up this key message that independence in Parliament was a good thing. And again, I think Monique Ryan in particular told a story again where she said, look, I have a problem with Australia's relationship with China. I know because I was speaking to somebody in my electorate. She's a Chinese Australian. She's been here for 40 years. And she said for the first time ever, she feels upset and also a bit unsafe in her own country. So they were able to bring the community along by saying, I'm listening to my community. Here, let me tell you a story about one person in my community. So there was just a lot to like about the Teal independence. They were different.
What do you think, Bernard? What was it that made them so successful? Do you agree with a lot of what Christine's just shared?
I think Christine's absolutely right, particularly about the way that they effectively communicated stories that really link them to voters. I think, look, I think psephologists are going to be looking at this election for a long time to try and work out where this came from. It's been this so-called Teal way has been developing for a long time. I can remember back in the Howard years that that the kinds of people who voted for the Teals in this election were being dismissed as doctors' wives, astonishingly insulting remark. Of course, they're now doctors. They're not doctors' wives. They're doctors. Dr. Scomps, Dr. Ryan. But there's clearly been a disconnect between affluent, educated voters in safe Liberal seats and the coalition's position on climate for a very long time. And Zali Steggall certainly picked up on that last time against the arch climate denialist Tony Abbott, but now it's broken out of, I think, a candidate-specific thing and become much more broad-based. It didn't matter how moderate or how pro-climate the other guy was, and it was always a guy. The Teal Independent did very well. I think the Independents really did benefit from the coalition/News Corp strategy of trying to demonise them at every turn. We go back to 1999, New South Wales state election, then Bob Carr was up against Kerry Chikarovsky. Now, Bob Carr went into that election in a minority government, or he might have just, courtesy of a by-election, scraped over into majority status, but it was very, very close parliament. Bob Carr did two things. One, he insisted that it was very, very close and that they wouldn't know the result on the night. The other thing he did, which of course dampened everyone's expectations, the other thing he did was he refused to ever mention Kerry Chikarovsky. Never said her name, barely referred to her policies, simply referred to my opponent. And I was reminded of that right throughout the campaign. Every time News Corp or the coalition savaged a particular Teal independent candidate, because I thought all you're doing is simply giving them name recognition. All you're doing is boosting their profile, and we saw it in the data that Andrew was providing. You know, in some cases they were getting more coverage than the candidate, the coalition candidate that they were up against. You know, I think the coalition would have been far better served by saying, okay, we're up against an independent, we'll treat them like an independent, like we usually do with independents, which is we ignore them. I mean, loads of independents stand at every election. Some of them are really good. Some of them complete nut jobs, some of them really good. But the major parties just, by and large, ignore them because they don't need to worry about them. And I can't help but think that if there'd been a bit more of that, then that name recognition factor for these candidates would have been significantly lower. Would have made a difference? I'm not sure, but I think it certainly would have contributed to you know, a less easy win for the Teals.
We're getting to the point of the session now where we're going to start doing audience questions soon. So this is just a little reminder for anyone to hit that question mark. Christine, I might just quickly go to you while we wait for some of those questions to flow through. What are the challenges that you see lying ahead for the Teals now?
Yeah, they have got some, and I think the main one is to be able to maintain that sense of community independence. I noticed that we're all calling them the Teal independents, but Simon Holmescourt, in his interview with ABC on election night, never called them the Teal independents. He always referred to them as the community independents, and I think that's what the independents themselves have to lock onto now, because it continually reminds people of where they've come from and who they represent. They need to start sounding different. Well, not start. They need to continue to sound different to your average politician. We all know the average politician gets a question they don't like, and so they just jump straight to whatever the key message was, and they never even attempt to answer that tricky question. I would like to see the Teals take a little bit more sophisticated approach to answering tricky questions and give some sort of acknowledgement and discussion first before they then obviously pivot to whatever it is that they want to talk about. I want them to continue to look different as well. We don't need any more highly tailored grey suits in Parliament. I want them to actually reflect the communities, the electorates that they represent. So if that means more interesting clothing, then go for it. I think that's great. And I think they need to always take up space. They can't be in their electorate all the time. They're going to have to spend some time in Canberra now. So they need to use their social media to be able to talk about what's going on in their electorate, even if they weren't there, which gives them a presence there and also helps them to take up virtual space. In leaders, we like people who can have power and status and authority. And one of the ways of doing it is physically or metaphorically taking up space. And they can do that through their social media pages. But we also like leaders who are warm and empathetic as well. So I want them to start creating a bank of anecdotes that they can tell about the people in their electorates and what they're going through and what they need from them, and start pulling those out and delivering those in interviews so that people always remember that they have come from community. I'd say those are the things that I would really like to see the Teals do. The community independence.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably awesome tips in there that anyone could do, right? We've got some excellent questions coming through. Thank you to so much who has put a question in the chat area. I'm just looking at those that have come through. Bernard, we've had a couple of questions come through on gotcha moments, and how for those gotcha moments that were coming through, do you think that they were actually useful throughout the election, or were they being placed to catch politicians out? What do you think about those moments?
Well, the question to Albanese about that led to the first gaffe was planted by the Prime Minister's office with the journalists. So it was part of a coordinated campaign. It's not to say it's not a fair question, but it set the tone for increasingly absurd questions, which led to Adam Bant being asked, I think, the wage price index. Now, I know the wage price index, but I don't expect my political leader to be able to reel it off. You know, and what next? You know, the Baltic Dry Shipping Index. I mean, it was to the absurd point. The thing about let's remember the original gotcha question of this whole campaign actually was to Scott Morrison when he was asked at the National Press Club earlier this year what was the price of milk and the price of bread. And he gave quite a right answer, which is, well, I'm not going to pretend that I know it. I don't go and do the shopping. And that's completely reasonable. Who expects Scott Morrison to walk out of the lodge and go down to Manuka Woolies and you know, do the family shopping? He's the Prime Minister. We want him to be governing the country, not you know doing the shopping. Now, that mindset that unless you have the exact lived experience of each ordinary Australian, then you are somehow incapable of contributing to public debate meaningfully. It's nonsensical. And it doesn't really tell us about who's out of touch. We know Scott Morrison was out of touch, but it wasn't about the price of groceries. We know Anthony Albanese's probably not the sharpest guy in terms of economic data, but he's got other strengths, and he's got Jim Chalmers, who is, you know, a highly experienced guy in Treasury. So I think what it became was a kind of a free-for-all among journalists as to who could ask, you know, the next big gotcha moment, and it became about journalists' egos, not about enlightening their audiences and their readers. And that, for me, was the big problem. One of the many instances where the media really failed was seeing it more about themselves than about actually making sure that voters were better informed at the end of a media conference than they were at the start.
May I just add to that, Ali, that I thought when Albanese failed to know the unemployment rate and the cash rate, the best reaction was John Howard's. The journalist put to him, did you realise that Anthony Albanese didn't know this? And his first immediate gut reaction was, so what? He changed his tune the next day, but I think Bernard's right on the money. It was a really so what kind of question.
I've got an interesting question for you that's come from the audience, Christine, which is, what advice would you have given to Catherine Deves to combat some of that negative coverage?
Look,
other than change your policy, maybe?
I've thought about this, and I've actually sort of chatted to a few people about it as well. I would have encouraged her to have gotten out there and done some interviews with the media. Remember, she was walking into events where she would talk to party faithful without talking to the media first. She was being hustled away, and I would have said, forget that. You need to be known for more than just your views on transgender athletes. Let's get you out there talking about some different things so that people learn a bit more about you. And actually, I would say the same thing about Anthony Albanese. At the beginning, nobody really knew who he was. Now we all know that he grew up in sort of the wrong side of the tracks with a single mother whom he adored, and he's risen from humble beginnings. But we all know that to death. Now we need to know more about Anthony Albanese. What other stories can he tell us to make him be more multi-dimensional? So I would have given that same advice to Anthony Albanese and Catherine Deves.
That's really interesting advice. Thank you for sharing. If they were your clients, we'll know that that's what's coming up to them if they're seeing this webinar. She's good. I need some advice. I'm going to her.
I don't know that Catherine Deves would have taken my advice, though. I think she was probably under instructions from the party to keep her head down, but that would have been my advice.
We've got a few really interesting questions here, and I know we're supposed to wrap up soon, so I might try and speed through a couple of them. I don't know if we can do a quick answer to this one, though. Question from Zane, does the panel think Scott M had an authenticity factor problem? How could he have repaired or mitigated that? Christine, what would you say to that one?
Problem is, I think he was authentic, and we just didn't like the authenticity that he was showing us. He could have been a bit more multidimensional. We heard an awful lot about his faith. I would have liked a few other bits and pieces, because I'm not a faith person, so it didn't matter to me. In fact, I kind of disliked him for it, that he was so Pentecostal. But if he'd shown me something else that I might have liked about him, that might have changed my view on him. I would urge everybody to go to the ABC election night coverage and watch Andrew Constance, who's the Liberal Party guy who hasn't yet won his seat. But he was totally authentic. He was dressed in a flanny. He had his hands in his pockets. He was really laconic and laid back. And when the journo said, "Do you think you're going to win?" He said with brutal honesty, "Look, you know what? I don't know. And at this time of the night, after a 6-week election campaign, I don't really care." And then he quickly backed that up and bridged to a key message, which is, look, I want to thank everybody for turning out. And what I think is, what we've learned from this is that we need to stop banging each other over the heads on the certain topics that people think matter. We need to switch the topics that we're talking about and be more collegiate. So I loved that bit of authenticity from Andrew Constance. I thought he was brilliant. We don't want people to be professional and political all the time. We want to see them relax a little bit and show us their human side.
We've got another couple of questions here, and we've talked a lot about the Teals today, or the community independents, but we haven't talked as in-depth about the Greens. Bernard, why do you think that Brisbane swung so far Green? What do you think is behind that? It's an audience question as well.
Well, there were no Teals for a start, so that community electorate-wide desire to shift, and I'm going to use the notorious air quotes, to the left on issues like climate and integrity, had nowhere to go but the Greens. So, I mean, look, Labor is better on the coalition, it's better than the coalition on climate, but it's not good enough. And I think there's a widespread sentiment within the community, certainly in metropolitan areas, but I suspect in a lot of regional areas as well, that Labor needs to do more, and that sentiment had to go somewhere. And a lot of the reaction from the shift away from the LNP to the left ended up bypassing Labor and going straight to the Greens. The other element of that is, look, it's a kind of almost it's time thing happening in Queensland for the Greens, because the Greens have really struggled up there for a long time. They've had the occasional success, but for a state with the highest level of solar panel, rooftop panel penetration in the world, the Greens have done peculiarly poorly up until now, but they kind of they made up for it at this election. So whether they can hang on to that, I don't know. The Greens tend to kind of wax and wane a bit between elections, so we'll see. But yeah, there's a bit of a kind of maybe a bit of a elastic band snap happening with their vote up there.
We've got a really interesting forward-thinking question, which I'll stay with you on, Bernard. So outside of the policy areas like ICAC and climate change, what does the panel expect to be on the policy agenda given the size of the crossbench now? And how do we think the ALP will deal with that?
Whoa. Look, the big issue over the next 12 to 18 months, probably longer, is going to be cost of living. And it's going to be economic management, because we've got rising inflation, we've got high interest rates, we've got this 10 years of wage stagnation, we've got a very, very difficult international situation. We've got some upsides to that. We've got really high energy prices, so that means we're one of the world's biggest energy exporters, so we're going to continue to benefit from that, except that we don't tax the energy companies properly, but that's another story. But ordinary households are really facing a lot of difficult circumstances over the next 12 to 18 months with inflation and real wage cuts and interest rates and electricity price rises. Electricity prices are going up because we've got too much coal in our electricity mix. So we can talk now about the issues that everyone wants to be addressed, and let's hope that I think they will be addressed. We're certainly going to see a federal ICAC. We're certainly going to see stronger climate policies. And we are going to see much more parliamentary commitment to gender equality in workplace, in income, and so on. But events are always the determining factor when it comes to politics, and I think those economic events are going to be really difficult. And it's not, there was talk during the election campaign, this might be a good election to lose. No election is a good one to lose, but nonetheless, I think this is going to be a difficult time economically for over the next 2 years.
Looking at the time, I think that we've already gone over a little bit. I know there are some questions that we didn't get to today. If it's possible, we'll link you up with the best panelists to answer your question. But thank you so much for joining me today. I almost enjoyed it as much as Saturday night, but not quite. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you all for being here and unpacking the things that worked, the things that didn't work. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our attendees. We'll let you know when we're hosting another conversation like this. An election doesn't come around so frequently, but there are lots of political moments and media coverage to unpack. So we'll see you again next time. Thank you, everybody. See you later. Have an excellent afternoon.